artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Welcome to episode 258. I have been talking with Drs. Emily Bender and Alex Hanna, authors of the upcoming book, The AI Con: How to Fight Big Tech's Hype and Create the Future We Want, which is a, quote, look at the technologies sold as artificial intelligence, the drawbacks and pitfalls of technology sold under this banner, and why it's crucial to recognize the many ways in which AI hype covers for a small set of power-hungry actors at work and in the world, end quote. Emily and Alex also host the live podcast Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000. Emily is well known for writing the 2021 paper On the Dangers of Stochastic Parrots, about how large language models do not really understand us. Mind you, I've got to say we have an African grey parrot here at home, and it's arguable that he does understand a lot of what's going on. Emily is a linguistics professor and director of the Computational Linguistics Laboratory at the University of Washington and was among the inaugural Time AI 100. Alex is a sociologist who looks at how the data that fuels AI technologies exacerbates racial, gender, and class inequality. She is Director of Research at the Distributed AI Research Institute and a Senior Fellow at the Center for Applied Transgender Studies. Last week, we talked about their intentions with the book Cycles of Hype and the Effects of Hype, the dangers of uncritical use of LLMs, slow science, and academic institutional culture. This week, we're going to talk about the dangers of uncritical naming, anthropomorphizing, Luddites and bespoke crafting, the effects of synthetic content on interpersonal communications, capitalism, and collective action strategies. So let's return to the interview with Emily Bender and Alex Hanna. I'd like to move on to naming, as you were talking about, and asking what are the consequences of lumping so much technology under the term AI, artificial intelligence. And you point out that we got that term because in 1956, John McCarthy didn't want to use the term cybernetics, which is what it would have been called because that was originated by Norbert Wiener, and then they would have had to have invited him to the conference, and he was a somewhat abrasive personality, so they came up with AI. But that is a famously vague umbrella term, not to mention contentious, that all kinds of things now fit under. How should we differentiate them?
So it's an umbrella term that things fit under. I think it's a marketing term that is applied to things to make them look good. And it's actually really quite fun to go back to that 1956 proposal. And among the things that they were listing were programming languages was part of their definition of AI. Because 1956, we didn't have programming languages. And when I was doing my undergrad and graduate degrees, the sort of standing joke was artificial intelligence referred to anything that we didn't know how to build yet with computers, right? And then somehow since then, it's become the name for everything, but it still sort of holds on to this like, well, it's magic, right? And it also links actual technology that people build to science fiction imaginaries of, both beneficent things like Lieutenant Commander Data and evil things like Skynet and the computer in 2001: A Space Odyssey. And so it sort of allows people selling technology to paint it with this brush of this is super powerful, just like what you read about in Isaac Asimov's robot stories, and also allows them to sort of group together any apparent wins or actual wins. Like if you think about AlphaFold, which is an effective system for predicting the structure of folded proteins on the basis of the amino acid sequence using supervised machine learning, right? If that's AI, and so is the image generation machine, and so is the system that supposedly predicts criminality or chances of reoffending, then of course, that thing that we're using to predict criminality is reliable and smart because, look, AI can also predict protein structure. And so differentiating and actually naming what's being automated and describing that particular automated task, I think, is a much better way to go forward.
How would you do that? The underlying technology in both those cases is still an artificial neural network.
Well, not necessarily. Like some of these things are actually implemented with other algorithms. But the underlying technology in everything we do on a computer is the microchip, right? But does that mean that we can't name Zoom as different from Microsoft Word, as different from our podcasting app?
Right, but those are those names. How would you differentiate the names for the things that you are describing so that the reliability is communicated or lack thereof?
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, we have names for many of these things. I mean, before we had ChatGPT or really these transformer models that could be claimed to be doing anything, I mean, this has been an intentional move to loop these technologies into quote unquote general purpose technologies. I mean, there's been a move from Stanford, HAI was to call things foundation models, or from this consortium of companies to then call them frontier models and X, Y, and Z. And so this has been an intentional move. But prior to that, we had distinct tasks of image classification, image localization, automatic speech recognition, machine translation. These things had a set of tasks. And going back, if you kind of look before this, there were these distinct tasks of calling this such. And there's a great essay by Emily Tucker that we reference in the book called Artifice and Intelligence. And it talks about the need to take this way in social sciences or in humanities, we would call this process reification, this idea of taking this LLM and try to make it a thing, give it a thingness to this that can't be scrutinized. But we have names for these different tasks. And the kind of difference is that these models that we had used looked a bit different and performed actually a bit better on separate tasks when they were better scoped, could be independently audited, had their training data disclosed, all these different elements that we were using prior to that. But now they all get lumped into AI, which is not a helpful distinction because it, just what Emily was saying, it signifies that one thing that could be quite adept at doing this sequence-to-sequence prediction can do this completely different thing just as well or with the same levels of accuracy, and that we're using evaluation from one sphere to be the same in evaluation in another sphere. I don't say my calculator is very good at arithmetic, so it can do my taxes sufficiently well, but it is a tool to do so.
As a sociological phenomenon, what do you observe about the ways in which masses of people are reacting to AI now? We'll use that term because that's their term, to imbue it with or see it as possessing certain traits and great power that exceeds what it's certainly currently capable of. What are the foundations of that, do you think, sociologically? And where do you see that going, given the nature of the pressures in our society, the different types of marketing and media?
Sure. I want to pull back and say that I think there's a desire to say that, okay, we want to anthropomorphize this thing as kind of this inherent kind of thing, of the way that we talk to our pets or something, like, oh, look what he did, like, oh my gosh, and try to anthropomorphize this. But I also want to pull back and say that this element of anthropomorphizing is also a choice that companies have really leaned into. There's a nice essay by a sociologist named Jeff Lockhart that was published on a blog, a sociology blog the other day called Scatterplot. And in it, he's talking about the interface of ChatGPT and saying that there's kind of like the ways in which it itself provides this, like, thanks for linking that, Emily, but like, I'm a chatbot, I can provide this to you, and it gives it to you as this sort of dialogue. But this is also, it doesn't have to be in this way. I mean, the way we've had computer programming is that you don't declare things in the imperative. You don't write Python code and say, I would like a function that multiplies. And there was attempts to do that in, like COBOL or whatever. Yeah, COBOL and whatnot, and or to some degree SQL and whatnot. But I mean, this is an intentional choice. And we're now to the point with AI agents that companies have completely run with that, right? This is an agent, or this is someone that can supplant or replace an individual on a one-to-one in doing particular tasks. And so their anthropomorphization is like, part of it is a human desire to do so, but companies have completely taken it and just ran with it and reinforced that idea.
And setting aside the overhype for the moment, the goal of computer science has always been to minimize the barrier between the person and the computer. The invention of high-level languages was designed not for the computer's sake, but for humans' sake, to reduce the size of the hurdle that you had to clear to get the computer to do what you want. And so in that sense, the LLMs are surely a great success story because they allow people with minimal, or say no training, to get a result out of the computer instead of having to learn some syntax.
So this conflates, sort of reduces the work of computer programming to actually writing the code. And the big issue with using LLMs in this context is that they are non-deterministic. And part of what you learn as you are also learning the syntax of a programming language is how to test what you're doing, how to conceptualize your algorithm, how to understand how it fits in as a module into larger modules, and to just like say to somebody, yeah, vibe coding's good enough. It looks good, it's done, right? Is if someone's just playing, that's one thing, although I still have all of the environmental and labor concerns. But if any of this gets into critical systems, we are collectively taking on massive technical debt as you have these systems that nobody actually wrote, nobody did the work of sort of conceptualizing and documenting. If they ever become mission critical, they then have to be maintained, and that's going to be a nightmare.
If I was to employ a admittedly hyperbolic comparison and say that this then sounds like we are going back to the era when clothing was all bespoke. And so if you wanted shoes, you had to go to visit the village cobbler to make them, and then argue that the process of being able to buy those off the rack would eliminate the knowledge of how to craft shoes, and then say, well, that doesn't seem likely to have happened. Plus, it's a lot more convenient to go and buy the shoes than to go visit someone and then come back 2 weeks later for them. What's the difference between that analogy and what we are risking with having LLMs help with our coding?
I mean, I would say that the move to fast fashion has been quite terrible. In terms of thinking about, not that we're going bespoke, but if these are the two poles that we're having to choose here between going to the cobbler or having sweatshop laborers having to make things that go to all these big box retailers that we've gone to, right? And I mean, the analogy is maybe more on the nose than you intended, given that like one of the examples that we talk about in the book is, this example of the Luddites and the way in which the original Luddites were these folks in 19th century England who were rebelling against these clothiers and these hosiers and these fabric makers who were moving from artisan clothing and textile development to these massive machines that were often operated with child labor or people who are in poverty or whatnot going into the labor force. And so this then disrupted the relations of artisans to sellers and sellers into markets and whatnot. And so in some ways, there's a lot of similarities insofar as kind of that, except that now you're getting to a place where, to take the metaphor to its full conclusion, it's not that you just have a shirt that is produced by fast fashion. You also have a shirt that might randomly combust at frequent times or fail. And, if you had I don't know if there's an analog to mission critical clothing, but certainly ones in which you might have a wardrobe malfunction. And so, I mean, you could also think about the metaphor insofar as the labor conditions, the environmental costs, the things that fast fashion really has cost us and are not net goods for society, and have also been at the end of these complex supply chains, which have led to things like the disaster that happened in Bangladesh, that these conditions, and then you have companies that are trying to say, well, we're trying to secure supply chains. And so in some ways, these LLMs are engaged in the same kind of process of obfuscation of labor conditions, of environmental conditions, and whatnot. So, I mean, are we going to go back to bespoke models in clothing? Well, we don't necessarily have to, but we can certainly think about what it means to scale these things which are fair, which have labor conditions which do not hurt the most marginalized of people. And there's not a one-to-one metaphor, but I'm running with it because it's what we have in hand. But are sourcing materials fairly, which are compensating people. And there is potentially an in-between which allows for that scale, but doesn't have all these deleterious impacts.
Well, I think that metaphor does still have some life in it, because we've talked about the Luddites on this show before and about the positive effects and intentions that they had. And the positive answer was not smash the machines, but create labor standards, collective bargaining, and other rules that restrained the engine of capitalism in favor of the workers. And is that perhaps the direction that we should be looking at, getting some purchase against the labor inequities that might be wrought by AI?
So let's be clear. Some machines should be smashed, and some machines are at the root anti-worker in their application. And to some degree, because the way that LLMs cannibalize other people's work, other people's artistry, then those are anti-worker devices. It's not to say that there aren't language models that could be controlled by worker collectives and could be used. And there's some different models. One kind of thing that I would like to shout out is Teheku Media, and it is a set of language and acoustic models, so machine translation and automatic speech recognition, that are controlled by the Maori speakers of Eritrea and New Zealand. And these are trained with data that is under their control on servers that they control, and that these are produced for community benefit. And we can envision something similar happening in particular for particular types of laborers. I've talked to a lot of creatives in my role as there in terms of technical workers or writers. But if something like ChatGPT comes in or Claude comes in, and a writer at a newspaper is being told, you must use this to generate your articles, and the clip of writing articles is you're going to go from writing one article a day, or even that's a lot, to 3 articles a day, because you can outline this with ChatGPT and then you fill in the bullet points. That is then accelerating the work of this writer and is making their work untenable, right? And so control can be collective in nature and it can be community-based in nature, but there are some tools which are, born anti-worker, and we need to be cognizant of that.
It's not just accelerating the work of the writer, it's accelerating the work of the reader. And it seems that we're in a race to the bottom at the moment. Every content provider is working on churning out much more, as much as possible, and using AI to accelerate that so that they can just get as many eyeballs as possible because of the attention-based economy. And the effects of that are not just seen in mass media, like blogs and so forth, but in business, when what might have been a 1-page memo before is now a 6-page report, and because it was inflated with AI. And as a reader, I'm not sure which part of this I need to pay attention to, possibly all of it, because I don't know how much of it was signed off on by the person who wrote it. I just know that I've got 6 times as much stuff to read, and that's not tenable either. What do you see happening with respect to content generation in general?
I think it's really important to value authenticity. I do my very best not to consume any synthetic media, and boy, do people like to send it to me. Look what ChatGPT said. I don't care. But it's about you. I really don't care. I don't want to see it, right? So one of the things we say in the book is, if you couldn't be bothered to write it, why should I bother to read it? And so I think what's really needed, as we are awash in synthetic media, is sort of rebuilding networks of trust on the basis of authenticity. And There's always going to be this inevitability narrative, like, well, this is the way of the future. Everybody's doing it. How can you resist? And I just will never give up on the idea that refusal is possible, and that what makes it tenable is actually the person-to-person connections and building these networks of trust.
Yeah, just in addition to that, there are other ways, I mean, in other types of economies of content that we're seeing this. And Foreign Media had some reporting on these Discord servers in which there was kind of this turnkey solution for producing content that these scammers were selling. I don't know if you would necessarily call them scammers. I mean, I'd call them scammers. I don't think they identify as scammers. But they promised this thing that you can press a button, it produces some kind of, it's like Minecraft, like gameplay or something with some music, and it's meant to just spin up something on TikTok or Instagram Reels, which are really where so much content is being created these days, right? And if you're going to monetize, it's going to be there. So that might be trivial, but this is just really kind of doing a DDoS on just those platforms. And those platforms do reward it in some ways since they reward engagement. And so thinking about that just as, a media consumer kind of in this idle scrolling type of way that we often produce or consume content, I mean, that is an unfortunate effect of that. And I mean, I think to what Emily's saying, rebuilding those networks of trust, especially by identifying, I think, creators who are committed to a certain type of production. And I think we already see a lot of people pushing back. I mean, what we say is we utilize ridicule as praxis. So a lot of times when there are creators who are producing things which are AI generated, and they're very clearly so. I mean, on those platforms, people really get on them and they're saying, use this, I hate this, I don't want to see this. And we see especially large creators that really have been cultivating networks of trust really have their audiences push back. So I think that is a strong tool as well.
Do these dynamics fall under a larger umbrella of AI being a tool which capitalism uses to magnify its exploitative aspects? It certainly is resulting in the concentration of capital in the hands of people who already have most of it. And do you think that the foundation of the negative dynamics here is capitalism?
Sure. And it makes it particularly infuriating when the systems are sold as democratizing anything. We see this word a lot. It's like, oh, we're going to democratize art, or we're going to democratize access to coding, or we're going to. And the thing about democracy is that it's about shared governance. And instead, what we're getting is this massive centralization of money, so capital in that form, of computing resources, and of access to data. And then the sort of ongoing justification of it, oh, it's making your life more convenient. And, to come back to the bespoke clothing versus fast fashion analogy, yes, it is more convenient to be able to click, click, click and have some clothes show up at the door, or, go to the big box store. But also the world in which we need that convenience is constructed, right? If you go back to the days when you went to the cobbler for your pair of shoes, you had a pair of shoes and it lasted a long time. And you did not have a society around you that said, no, you can't wear the same thing over and over again. So yes, the short answer is yes. And I also wanted to say those things.
Right. It also seems, though, that world, as appealing as it is, sounds like a Disney-esque fantasy of a mountain village populated by fairy tale characters that is as far out of reach as fairy tales are now. To work towards our conclusion here, what are the concrete points of leverage that you want to push on and you want your readers to pull for you? It's a bad metaphor, but I hope it communicated itself.
Concrete points of leverage. There is, first of all, things that we can do in the form of collective action through regulation. Right? So we can push for data minimization. We can push for transparency and accountability. And, you mentioned that it feels like a Disney-esque fantasy to go back to a mountain village where there was the cobbler where you would get your shoes. The world is what we make it. And we're so frequently asked to buy into the fantasies of the tech companies that, why not also present other visions of the world and then work towards them? And mountain villages are lovely, but that's not the only thing that I would be looking for. But I think that a big part of it is, as we talk to our policymakers, making sure that they hear something other than this is inevitable. You don't know enough about how technology works to be able to regulate it anyway. And regulation stifles innovation. These are a set of narratives that come there that we can, as members who are represented by these policymakers, especially in functioning democracies, use our voices to push back. So that is one kind of collective action, but it's not the only one. And I'm wondering, Alex, if you want to pick up some there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a lot of different types of collective action that folks have really leveraged as a means to bring these things under control. I mean, I think we should be, in the case, if we're going to take the metaphor of writing, for instance, one of the big things that happened in 2023 is that the Writers Guild of America won a lot of strong worker protections on what it means to be a writer in Hollywood. And so instead of having to correct a script that was prompted and then extruded by an LLM that a producer made, the writers are still in the writing room and they can tell their unique stories and can tell these stories that are not most represented in the training corpus, but are coming from their personal human experience, right? And that is a win. That is a writer's win. The same thing with National Nurses United, which is pushed back on some of the intrusion of kind of automated surveillance systems in the clinician's office when, actual skilled nursing care is required there. So their patients' health and conditions are their working conditions. So I think really trying to know that those are not these kind of mountain villages, but these types of things are being won at work right now and won in certain other collectives like consumer groups and artist groups and whatnot. I think, like Emily said, we have to be willing to ask for these futures that we want, especially because we want to push back on this notion that these things are inevitable. And important ways of doing that is having collectives that do that, right? And so, I mean, these things don't happen automatically. It's not that capitalism's worst excesses seem to self-correct. That's at least not my theory of change. People are doing these things, and when collectives get together, that's what they actually win.
Are we missing a collective? You mentioned the writers. I was speaking in Hollywood during the strike, and I know very well how they felt. And they had the Guild to advocate for them. Is there another collective that would amplify the voices of your readers so that they're not just writing a letter to their congressperson?
Yeah, what a good question. I mean, it depends on where people are, where people are located, right? I mean, I think that whether it's a kind of collective of people who are workers who are fighting for some of this in terms of artists. There's, for instance, artist guilds that don't have the same kind of bargaining power that the writers had. You could also think about consumer groups. You could think about local efforts to maintain the libraries. I mean, I don't think there's a national or supranational type of organization. I mean, these things have to be a lot more local. I mean, the old adage, think global, act local, I think really applies in this case.
When you're putting yourself out like this, it invites the question of whether you would want to start such a thing.
I mean, we're writers and we're authors and researchers. Sometimes we're organizers, but I think there's a lot of people that are already doing this work and doing important work. And I mean, this is echoing Marianne Kaba, the organizer and abolitionist, in which she says, find something to join. There's a good chance that there are people already doing things in which you're interested in. And if there's not, then there might be ample opportunity to do so. But I think there's a lot of organizations that need that support, that need that energy. And I think a lot of people are being activated right now. I mean, just look at the Federal Unionist Network that formed and was able to organize quite quickly after DOGE came in and started issuing reduction in force directives to members of the federal government. And that has been an organization that's grown quite exponentially in the past couple months. And so I think there's ample opportunity to build, and there's a lot of necessity for it right now.
Sounds like a good note to be ending on. Emily, any final notes for our listeners?
I'd like to remind people that no is always an answer, that you don't have to use this. And if you find it being used on you, then it's worth speaking up. It's worth looking for what your local networks of support are so that you can push back. And certainly we can consistently refuse the imagined future that we're being told is inevitable.
Thank you very much. Well, at this point, our time is up. And so I'll just say the book is The AI Con, How to Fight Big Tech's Hype and Create the Future We Want by Emily Bender and Alex Hanna. Thank you very much for coming on AI and You.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us, Peter.
That's the end of the interview. While there are points where I clearly disagree with Emily and Alex, as I've said, our job here is not to be right, but to learn. And they are bravely swimming upstream against a considerable current that by its nature is certain to be wrong in places. And Emily and Alex are pointing us towards those places. The future will afford us the hindsight of seeing where those places are. At the moment, issues like what I call cognitive autonomy, or the determination of your own thought processes without them being either maliciously influenced by misinformation or atrophied through over-reliance on AI, are becoming visible but not clear. So we should pay attention when people buck the trends to point towards where we aren't looking or don't want to look. There's a link to their book in the show notes and transcript. They also brought up the importance of naming things correctly and what happens when we don't do a good job of that. Even the term artificial intelligence itself is something we've talked about on this show. How different would things be if, say, it had been called electronic cognition, which means the same thing, as far as I can tell. And they relate the interesting anecdote that we already had the term cybernetics. But if John McCarthy had used that in his 1956 paper, they would have had to invite Norbert Wiener, the inventor of the term, to their conference, and they didn't want to do that because he was a somewhat abrasive character. On such trivia does history turn. In today's news ripped from the headlines about AI, Google now has a large language model that speaks dolphin. Yes, we can finally find out just what Flipper was saying in all those old TV shows. Maybe something like, call my agent, or I want residuals. The model, called Dolphin Gemma, and its cetacean hearing augmentation telemetry, which spells chat, I swear this is not an April Fool's joke, are being tested to see if they can mimic the vocal behavior of dolphins. The researchers have managed to correlate sounds with behavioral patterns such as courtships, unique names, and dolphin quarrels. Dolphin Gemma receives and interprets audio inputs and then predicts likely subsequent sounds for recreation. Then it interfaces with the chat system on their modified Google Pixel phones. The system cannot entirely translate a dolphin's natural way of communication, but it can help us establish a more simplified, shared vocabulary. There's a lot to be taken from this, besides making jokes about, so long and thanks for all the fish. How much more likely are we to ascribe sentience or consciousness to a species whose language we can understand or reproduce? This may bring us closer to our cetacean cousins. Next week, my guest will be Dr. Nada Sanders, expert in forecasting, global supply chains, and human technology integration, and author of the 2023 book, The Hume Machine, Humankind, Machines, and the Future of Enterprise. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.